Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Hong. I am a core member of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the afternoon session on Cold War Solidarities. This is a conversation between the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective and Black Alliance for Peace. And I wanted to say before we begin that all throughout this conversation, please do feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section. You can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen that on the right, you'll either have a menu item that says Q&A or you'll see 3 dots. One of those will get you to the Q&A function. If you are on your phone, you'll find that in the upper right corner. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that today's session is being recorded. So without further ado, what I would like to do is thank our sponsors, Yale University, and above all, Lisa Lowe. And so Lisa Lowe has been in conversation with the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective for going back 4 years about this series of events, conversations that are happening today and tomorrow. And that takes a steadfastness and a commitment to this work that is uncommon. And also, this work is done by activist scholars, and it's a grassroots endeavor. And support from institutional spaces has helped us to be able to launch the work that we do. The overall module that we are launching for this session and this framing for this symposium is Race, War, and Empire. And today's conversation with Jackie Lukeman of Black Alliance for Peace is a central part of a necessary and overdue conversation about the ways in which race, war, and empire are entangled, and really, in some ways, their logic gutted, and there's violence sort of recoded during the Korean War. And I'll say this too: the Korean War is not over. It is uh, we in the EKW Collective speak about the Korean War not as an event, but as a structure of ongoing military imperial violence. So Jackie Lukeman is the co-coordinator of the Mid-Atlantic region, the DC Citywide Alliance, and recently the chair of the coordinating committee of Black Alliance for Peace. This is an amazing organization. I have no doubt that many of you are well aware of the far-reaching, deeply consequential work, really razor sharp analysis that BAP furnishes. BAP is an international, people-centered human rights formation that has long organized against war, repression over there and here, and imperialism. She's a radio show host and journalist. She hosts the weekly show Darker Than Blue. Please do check that out. She's a political commentator on the Black Liberation Media YouTube platform, and she's a frequent contributor to the amazing Black radical publication, Black Agenda Report. And in the link, you can see more of and support Jackie's work by clicking on those links. Um, and so, Jackie, just welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting BAP into this space. Thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you. This is really exciting for us. I mean, it is a time that's fraught with a lot of worry, anxiety, tension, fear. But for us, we acknowledge that many people are feeling that way in this country and certainly around the world. But we also see this moment as I think only revolutionaries and anti-imperialists and anti-colonial fighters can see it, as that moment that Gramsci talks about when he says a new world is being born, now is the time of monsters. We get that, yes, the monsters are fully exposed now, we think. We believe the contradictions of capitalism and imperialism and racialized oppression in both of those systems that are inextricably connected. The mask of civility and American diplomacy and the pursuit of democracy, we think has been ripped off with the back-to-back massive imperialist actions committed by the United States against sovereign nations over the past two, really three administrations. And so we see this moment as, yes, a time of monsters, but also an incredible opportunity to do exactly what we exist to do. And that is to continue and to revive and to expand the Black radical anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial tradition of international solidarity and struggle. There is no better time for us to be engaged in this discussion. The clarity around the Korean War that we absolutely need to understand our material conditions and why we need to be in solidarity with the Korean people, because their enemy, your enemy, is the same as ours.
Yeah. You know, what you are saying is reminding me of the fact that we have a political genealogy and kinship. And with regard to the middle part of the 20th century, when the United States was waging a war that was horrifying in its catastrophic impact. I mean, when Donald Trump, during his first administration, threatened North Korea with fire and fury, that wasn't just a future reference to potential violence. It registered intimately in terms of a known history and experience of devastating bombing at the hands of the United States. And during this time, the middle part of the 20th century, it wasn't like the late 1960s when students were organizing against the US war machine. McCarthyism was at its sort of high water moment.
Mhm.
And people, there was a climate, a chilled climate of profound fear. Yet some of the only people who spoke out and who spoke out with clarity were Black radicals who had a critique based upon their work in the Communist Party in terms of labor organizing, who had a critique of imperialism. And I wonder if we can go. I'd love for you to speak about the work that BAP does. Could we go into our slideshow? Um,
Mhm.
let's see. So, Jackie, I was wondering if you could speak about BAP and the work that you do. I wanted people to see your incredible mission statement.
Yeah, so when BAP was formed in 2017, the mission of the co-founders and the those who advised on forming the project really did intentionally focus on launching the formation of BAP on April 4 to commemorate Dr. King and his Beyond Vietnam speech, and his focus on, which was his intention, to focus the civil rights movement and the working class and poor Black population in America specifically beyond the confines of civil rights, and connecting the struggle for civil rights, expanding it to the idea of human rights, universal human rights, and connecting that to the inability to achieve even civil rights in this country with this country's focus on militarism, racism, and poverty, the three evils that he spoke of plaguing American society at the time. So when BAP was formed, there was a recognition that these three evils that King spoke of are still a part of the foundation of American imperialism and domestic militarism as they exist in the world today and as they proliferate. So the mission of the Black Alliance for Peace was really quite literally to continue to revive this brave and unrestrained in its pursuit of international solidarity and peace with all peoples struggling against, which at the time during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s was a growing movement against imperialism and colonization. We recognize that the response of the imperialist states stymied that movement, and it was necessary because of the new era of militarism that was emerging at the time, that sentiment among Black radical communities needed to be revived in order to protect our people, to raise the consciousness of our people, and protect our people in some way from getting caught up in that militarism as our communities had been caught up before and used to advance imperialist ideology masked as, American democracy and commitment to human rights and equality, when the reality of the material conditions of our people inside the imperialist machine reflected a very different reality of what life is like inside the American empire. So BAP was created to continue that work and to expand that work in our communities. And we believe we have done that, but we also believe we are not anywhere near done. As long as imperialism continues to wreak havoc around the world and the connected capitalism continues to oppress us and all working class and poor marginalized people in this country, our work is not done. So we continue to exist and we continue to do this work to amplify the contradictions that are being heightened and exposed and explain to our people what the contradictions are. Like, the problem is not Donald Trump. The primary contradiction is the system that would allow a Donald Trump to exist and emerge. Do you know what I mean? And what the policies that come from such a system that seem to be only directed at people around the world that are not connected to us, but explaining to our people that not only are the problems that are created by the invasion, the bombing, the lawfare, the coups in their countries, that US imperialism causes for them, those things also cause problems for us in very much the same ways, even though it looks kind of different on a domestic scale compared to an international scale. But it is those similarities in the ways this system presents its capitalist domination and dictatorship here, and the way US imperialism is imposed on people abroad, that connects us to all people struggling against imperialism, just as our revolutionary elders told us that it does.
I love the phrase that you're using, revolutionary elders. And I love the idea also of a political genealogy.
Mhm.
And, we can't always choose our family, but we can choose our political kin. And, I also, you know, the work of BAP and the work of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective and the anchoring site for EKW is the Korea Policy Institute, which formed now 20 years ago in a time when George W. Bush was placing North Korea as part of a tripartite axis of evil.
Mhm.
And during that time, we realized there was no clarity in terms of the general public in the United States about one, the fact that the Korean War wasn't over, and two, in this moment in which human rights, far from having like the sort of anti-imperialist dimensions of human rights, which is a sort of counter tradition, you know, that was getting gutted. And in fact, human rights was getting seized by warmongers and like also um, thinly renovated Cold Warriors as a way of calling for fortified sanctions against North Korea and even calling for war. Like calling for humanitarian catastrophe, like starvation and war and what have you. And so we realized that in this situation that was characterized by such a lack of clarity, there had to be an organization that furnished critical analysis with regard to this. And I wanted to say too that, the giant triplets that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of, this also goes to that political genealogy. I mean, Paul Robeson in the 1950s spoke about and criticized the general American public, its conformity with what he called the politics of the war-minded, the racists, and the rich.
Mhm.
And so, it's, I think that in knowing that we have those revolutionary elders who came before and studying their struggle so as to inform ours, it actually heartens us. It gives us, it strengthens our movement
Mhm.
across generations, actually, and across lifetimes. I'm wondering if, well, actually, Madeline, would you mind going to the next slide? And this is our acknowledgement slide. And then could you go to yes? So I wanted to say, you know, as I mentioned, in a kind of desert wasteland in which the kind of received common sense about Korea was that the United States had this wonderful democratic ally in South Korea, but North Korea and um, Ileana Ross Latinen of Florida basically said that North Korea was a heart of darkness. So here you have this, like, and in fact, um, Donald Rumsfeld was entertaining the possibility of a two-front war strategy so that the war on terror would have a front in the Middle East and that he could take on, the United States could also reanimate its war in Korea. And so there's this sort of pervasive sense that South Korea is democratic, North Korea is demonic, that it's a giant gulag. And in fact, some of these right-wing, warmongers describe North Korea as a society that is essentially a prison, and they describe themselves as abolitionists. So in this kind of landscape, to see the clarity of BAP on North Korea is not something small. And so I just would ask you, how has North Korea featured in your work? And where does your clarity come from, the clarity of your analysis?
Well, I think part of our clarity comes from history, and I'll get to that in a minute. But because we are anti-imperialist and not just anti-war, we understand that there is an enormous difference between being anti-war, which I mean, I guess that makes sense. It's not that it's bad. It's just that when a sovereign people is left no choice but to defend themselves against armed invaders, at that point there is no more diplomacy that obviously can work. So this is not a situation where people who are facing imperialist domination, whether we're talking about sanctions, whether we're talking about lawfare, whether we're talking about, in the case of Korea, a full-scale invasion and utter decimation of an entire society, that's not something that people should be expected to just, lay down and allow to happen. So we understood the Korean War to be a case of a sovereign people defending themselves against US invasion and domination. Now, history itself, history in this country, and this is, I think, where we can look at and understand the pervasiveness of US propaganda and the ability with which the state in this country has been able to propagandize Korea out of historical memory. It's not, the Korean War is really not taught in school. I mean, none of the wars, the imperialist wars that the US has been involved in, are taught in school as that, as wars of imperialist domination led by capitalist dictatorship. No, they are framed as, wars of freedom and, Americans protecting democracy, or something foolish like that, which is never the case. But the Korean War in particular is really not talked about at all in curriculums, in public school curriculums. I don't know that it's taught a lot in a lot of mainstream college and university curriculums, unless there is this kind of a forum for the
Mhm.
conversation to be had. And it's certainly not something that's discussed in popular culture. As a matter of fact, when North Korea has been discussed in popular culture, it's been through a television series that everybody thought was actually about the Vietnam War, but it wasn't. It was about the Korean War, and that was MASH. So you
Mhm.
have a television series that was a comedy about one of the most devastating US imperialist actions, probably short of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
Right. I
that
mean,
the US empire, through its control of media, framed as something to laugh at and obscured the context of it so much that everybody thought it was about another war and not the Korean War. So our clarity is came from analyzing the way this state frames the Korean War, what the state says about Koreans, what the state says about why they got involved in Korea, and then analyzing what Koreans say about it. And from our understanding of imperialism and colonialism, and who
mhm.
are the primary drivers of those phenomenon today, and at that time, we surmised from our own analysis that the Korean War was a war against colonization and imperialism. And in that way, we are in solidarity with the Korean people against those things. But also, our revolutionary ancestors already told us that this war was a war against imperialism, that the resistance of the Korean people to US interference in their countries and affairs was a violation. Well, the people's resistance of that was the resistance of imperialism and colonialism. So they already told us that we need to be in solidarity with them, because our people who had no liberation or freedom in this country were sent to fight in a segregated military in another country to kill brown people for largely white supremacist pan-European finance capital. So our revolutionary ancestors told us we need to be in solidarity with Koreans too, because they are fighting against the same enemy that we're fighting against.
I so appreciate um, everything that you're saying. It's I am reminded time and again, when you were saying that we don't learn anything about the Korean War, and there's virtually nothing about US um, imperialist wars in our education, although there's some sort of sense that, okay, World War II was the good fight, but there's rarely a discussion of what anti-fascism meant in the context of World War II. And then there's a sense that somehow like Vietnam was a national trauma. There's very little discussion. There's nothing really of the Vietnamese people's revolutionary struggle against US imperialism. But then there's this kind of like blotted out interval of the Korean
Mhm.
War. And even during its own historical moment, it was getting referred to as the Forgotten War. And
Mhm.
what are we forgetting? Like, why does it have to be forgotten? Was it just this itty bitty conflict on this dinky peninsula someplace over there? Or what happens when we say, wait, the Korean War is not over? It's not an event, it's actually a structure. And what did that structure enable? And that's when I think things become much clearer because the Korean War actually justified the consolidation of a formidable infrastructure of imperialist violence that includes the military industrial academic complex, the national security state. It gave McCarthyism its long run, as some scholars have stated, and it placed this country on permanent war footing. And war planners and in the State Department and the military, they basically, on the US side of things, they let the cat out of the bag. They stated there had to be a Korea here or elsewhere around the world. They also said Korea came along and saved us. That's because a US economy that was geared toward total war because of World War II needed to have permanent war to rehabilitate itself. So the lesson of the Korean War is that the United States, what you said, has been depicted as farce ever since, perpetrated one of the greatest catastrophes, the magnitude of which very few people know about. And, I also want to say that one thing that I really appreciate about this BAP statement is um, the reckless machoism and the
Mm.
chicken hawks.
Mhm.
And, I love that colorful language. And it reminds me of North Korea, because North Korea, in its statements to the world and its global sort of international media organ, it uses the most colorful phrases in basically playing the dozens with imperialist powers. And so it's just like, I appreciate this. Madeline, can you go to the next slide? I want to show another
Mhm.
slide here too. I mean, here is another statement from Beth and this really incredible critique of the sexist and patriarchal imagery that the bipartisan war party and Democrats were using with these dog whistles to white supremacy.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could just speak about this. I mean, this is not the kind of analysis that you can see anywhere in the vast majority of US media, even in progressive spaces.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to our understanding as history, and the not the well, yeah, I think it is the recapturing of the historical memory of Black liberation struggle and the historical memory of Black internationalism, Black radical internationalism, from not just a Black perspective, but also with Black radical women lending a lot of very necessary context to the framing of some of the rhetoric and some of the talking points about countries that are targeted for imperialism that they got from the US in regard to Korea. So the same way that the US media was through a lot of political cartoons, demonizing Korea using the obvious, disgusting, repulsive, racist stereotypes of what Koreans look like, and they're being sneaky, and the sneaky plotting Asians that you can't trust, and that type of thing. We understood that the way the both the Democrats and the Republicans have demonized North Korea and the tradition, something as innocuous and simple as this picture that we're seeing of the two leaders holding hands. This is a traditional, it's a cultural thing. It is no different than the ruling monarchs in Saudi Arabia who do the same thing. It is a cultural traditional thing, but in demonizing everything, or in the need to demonize everything relating to North Korea, even to a simple tradition that is very common, and reflects respect and mutual admiration and unity. The empire has to make that something nefarious in order to continue to present North Korea as this bizarre, unique Orientalist enemy of the US. We can't figure out what they're doing. Look at these weird people with their bizarre customs. Aren't they weird? Well, we don't know what they're up to. We can't trust them. They're sneaky. They're holding hands. So on the one hand, the State Department and the US media were making crude and vile sexual jokes about these two male leaders holding hands. But then on the other hand, the same media apparati are diminishing them as human beings, as men, and as leaders who deserve respect for entering into whatever negotiations or agreements that they've decided to, and deciding to honor that. Instead, the empire has to tear them down in the typical pan-European white supremacist Western, yes, very patriarchal way that it does when it wants to dehumanize a group of people so they can continue to be seen as the enemy worthy of US aggression and domination. We recognize that immediately. And this is why we put out this statement. This is not the only statement we have put out in support of Korea's efforts to, and specifically the Democratic Republic of North Korea, in their efforts to defend themselves against continued US imperialism and aggression under every administration.
Yes.
So we recognize this, and when we are able to tie these kinds of things that happen today in US politics and US media, we do not like to miss an opportunity to remind people this is not new. This is the continuation of a pattern of how the United States government sees and engages with people's governments in other countries, especially if they don't like them.
Right. Oh, so I mean, North Koreans used to use this expression. It's 우리 민족끼리. It's basically like between us, like on
Mm,
our own terms, like we
mhm,
can settle it. Like, in other words,
yes.
get the hell out.
Hmm.
Like imperialists, get the hell out. And so, like, that idea of like our people amongst ourselves will deal with it. And yet, the United States has always maintained its right to intervene, and oftentimes in language and a perspective that is so sanctimoniously self-congratulatory about its
Hmm.
own liberal superiority. And so, like North Korea is viewed as um, a kind of illiberal hellhole. And, like these illiberal hellholes, just as there was the kind of propaganda lead up to the US invasion of Afghanistan using a kind of let's free Afghani woman,
Right.
there's also this kind of sense that um, illiberal places of the world, North Korea being preeminent among the worst offenders, um, need to have US intervention to make the world sort of safe for a certain kind of supposed liberalism. I mean, I think that we can contest whether or not this liberalism even exists. And I want to say too that there's no way then, because of this sort of self-congratulatory posture of the United States and its use, of human rights as a kind of a bully or like a sort of billy club against North Korea, there's very little way to understand the profound racism of US foreign policy toward the entire damn world.
Mhm.
The Native Hawaiian organizer, Hanani K. Trask, she said, there's one word for US foreign policy. It's militarism. And imperialist forms of militarism basically take the entire world as a target. And um, they sanction group differentiated mass death in terms of targeted people. How is that not racist? And why don't we understand the operations of the war machine, not just to unfortunately result in collateral damage, to use the War Department's terminology, but to understand it as the operations of racism?
Yeah, because we don't recognize how deeply propagandized we are and have been our entire lives. I don't think that most people, and I do believe this is something that more people are awakening to, because once again, the contradictions are being exposed in a very uncomfortable and brutal way for many people. But sometimes that just is the way the consciousness of the mass has to be raised when nothing else that we have tried has been able to reach the mass, because of the internal contradictions of the left in the US. That's very true. Because much of the left in the US, and this is the other reason that many people in the US do not understand imperialism having an explicitly racial dynamic, is because of the contradictions within the left around the issues of racism, and race as something that is inextricably tied. We like to say that it's the primary contradiction. Racism is the primary contradiction of capitalism. And in that connected way, and we say that because the history, the current material conditions, and the data, since people like to talk about data all the time now, the data bears out that even if people in this country at every level, in the private and public sector, in all of the employment fields, if they all say we are not racist, we have equal hiring practices, we do not discriminate against anybody, then explain the continued disparities between incomes for similarly qualified and educated Black and white people, white and Latin descended people, white and Asian people. People in this country do not understand that there are poor Asian people, because, and as a matter of fact, the vast majority of immigrants from Asia throughout the world, whatever part of Asia they are from, are in fact working class and poor. But because we are deeply propagandized into a racist stereotype of the model Asian minority, we do not understand. First of all, we don't understand that that is a racist stereotype, but we also don't understand the nature of capitalist or racialized capitalism, that every group of people in this country that is not European descended or that does not adhere completely to the white supremacist pan-European ideology of Americanism, which is a settler colonial white supremacist ideology, then they are the other two. They are not
Mhm.
accepted into the into whiteness in America. So even the so-called model majority folks, if they're still anti-imperialist and they understand that capitalism is a problem and they don't want to be fully American, then they don't get the perks of supposedly being American either. But then of course there is the white working class that also does not understand that the oppression, the class oppression that they feel from the same capitalist bosses and the finance capital dictatorship is worse for racialized working class and poor people. So the stealing of the wages of the white working class is absolutely a real thing. And they
Mhm.
suffer tremendously for it. But Black workers are paid less, so they have more of their money stolen. Do you understand? And then on top of that, then Black members of the Black working class have to also deal with the racism from their white counterparts,
Mhm.
who are supposed to be people who have more in common with them than they do with bosses. But for some reason, too much of the white working class, not all, but too much of the white working class finds some type of ideological allegiance with the bosses because of racism. And this is a
Yeah.
struggle that we have had in the left and we
Yeah.
continue to have on the left,
Mhm. Mhm.
where you now see some left elements celebrating imperialism
Mhm.
because they don't like a DPRK, because
Mhm.
of what this white supremacist government has said about the sneaky Asians
Yeah.
in North Korea. They don't like China. They are happy with imperialist aggression toward China because of their own Orientalism. That is informed by white supremacy through State Department talking points about China. They're happy with using Ukraine against Russia because now Russia, they're not white anymore. According to the axis of evil, the EU, or like what we like to call the axis of domination, the United States, the European Union, and their international gang of thugs, NATO. So since they have decided that Russians are not European anymore, now they're Asians, they're Mongoloids. Now there are elements on the left who have revived this hatred, this anti-communist based hatred of Putin in particular, but Russia in
Yeah.
general, that they don't understand is also informed by this Orientalist, xenophobic,
Mhm.
vile vitriol from the U.S. state. So
Yeah.
we are propagandized not to see the way the United States government frames other people, literally
Yeah.
dehumanizes entire
Mhm.
populations
Mhm.
in the process of setting those people up to be dominated and exploited and repressed in various ways through US imperialism, but also setting us up to cheer it on or to ignore
Wait.
it as
Yes.
something that's
Yeah.
not connected to us, because after all, that's those people over there, and you can't trust those sneaky Chinese like the US
Right.
government
Right.
said, so why should we care? Do you see? So this is
Yeah.
how it works.
Yeah. I wonder, Madeline, would you mind going to the next slide? It is how it works. And it's the kind of, it's like the devil principle or the enemy principle.
Mhm.
And that's an old fascist trick. And so, do you recall when George W. Bush stated, um, he said, I don't know why so much of the world hates us, like why they hate us. And then he said this thing, he said, and I thought that it was a real moment of clarity. He said, you're either with us or you're against us. And
Mhm.
so, like, this kind of good Asian, bad Asian, the model minority or the, red, yellow peril, like this kind of division has everything to do not with the content of a kind of political system, but everything to do with alignment with imperial power.
Mhm.
And so, that entire good Asian, bad Asian, it also reminds me that we're going to have another conversation about the term gook. And
Mm,
like during the
mhm.
Korean War, you would see like in the New York Times and all these other papers that these generals, these US generals and colonels, observing what was happening on the ground, would see the Chinese and see the Koreans fight, and North Koreans fighting, but the South Korean forces bugging out. And so, like, there was this sort of assertion that their gooks fought like hell, but ours cut and ran. And so that
Wow.
was the kind of statement that was made. And the difference between gooks is political. One set is fighting a people's war,
Mhm.
the other one is aligned with an imperialist invading force. And the ones fighting a people's war have an organic relationship with the land and the communities and the society. The ones who are aligned with imperial power function as a source of military intelligence that helps the US military, as was done domestically in terms of domestic warfare throughout the Cold War, wage wars of counterintelligence.
Mhm.
So, as with COINTELPRO and its security index lists, you had blacklists, gray lists, and white lists. Indigenous or native intelligence went into that, people complicit with the war machine in order to identify who's the head of the women's league, who's a teacher, who's
Mhm.
this, who's that. And so you have blacklists, kill on sight. You have gray lists, wavering, not sure, maybe kill. You have white lists, for sure will collaborate. And it's that whitelist that you use in order to perpetrate regime change on the ground.
Mhm.
And so here you have target North Korea. And as much as racism operates according to the logic of exclusion, you know, racism also operates according to the logic of inclusion. And during World War II, Black anti-fascists understood that fascism operated according to the enemy principle, and that fascism, which, as with imperialism, eventuates in war, uses the idea of the enemy to create a brutal solidarity. As you were saying, like white working class has much in common with working class peoples who are not white.
Mhm.
And as Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about in that Declaration of Independence from the US war in Vietnam, um, the Black working class from the Jim Crow agricultural South, the white working class, and the Vietnamese peasant had more in common, but were separated according to the lines of enmity. And that was a brutal solidarity. And here you have North Korea that creates a war-forged unity. According to American nationality, placing Americans against North Korea, regardless of race and class. That kind of militarized multiculturalism, which some people say, oh, that's liberalism. Black radicals were so clear. No, that's not liberalism. That's fascism. That's fascism. I wonder, Madeline, if you can go to the next slide. Because in what universe can this degree of devastation be understood as liberalism? This is Pyongyang in 1950. It was, it's the capital of North Korea, and it was a city that previously had 400,000 residents. The United States dropped 420,000 bombs on this capital city. That's more than one per person. And this is when North Koreans learned to live underground. Farmers came out at night in order to farm. People studied, schools were, day became night, below became above. This is what had to happen. It was the entirety of North Korea was understood racially as a red area, bad Asian. And the bombing was utterly unrestrained. And why is it that people don't understand? When people talk about anti-Asian racism, they tend to think that you need to have a hater. If you don't have a hater and you don't have like a shooter who, says, yeah, I hate Asian women. And if that person doesn't say that, the racism wasn't operative. But they don't understand that militarism, by positioning the world as a target, renders the vast majority of the world vulnerable to premature death, and that is structurally racist. This is racism. Oh, can you unmute?
Oh, sorry,
Okay.
my dog was barking in the background for a minute there. I had to mute very quickly, but that is absolutely true, and and as we've seen history play out, and this is why I love history so much. I am not a historian, but I love history because history, I didn't become a communist. I didn't become a Pan-Africanist. I did not become desirous of a socialist society by reading Marx, by reading Das Kapital. I have read it. By reading the Communist Manifesto. I did read it. Do you understand? I read, the State and Capital, and okay, I didn't finish that one, but I started. But I did not come to see a viable alternative to capitalism until I started to look at how the people I know are faring in the capitalist system. And I began to realize that the people I know, most of whom are people who look like me, live in the same neighborhoods I do, are in pretty much the same economic situation I'm in. Our material conditions are much worse than people who are white, who come from different backgrounds. And they come from different backgrounds because they have different access to things that people who look like me do not have access to. And then I have to start asking myself, why is that? Is it because of what we are doing wrong? No, it is because the people who make the decisions about who to provide access, services, resources to have decided that we as a group of people, we meaning Black people, we meaning immigrants of every country that is not a European nation, we meaning all Asian people, we meaning anti-imperialists, anti-fascists, leftists, communists, socialists, we have been declared the enemy, not just by the state, but the state has convinced the citizens who call themselves patriots. And
Yeah.
they're always the people who tell you that they're Christians, they love the Constitution, and they love America. This is what these kind of people will always say. This is their checklist for Americanism. And the fourth thing is that they do not see us as sufficiently American. So they may not think they are racist, but they do not understand that their biases are informed by the racialization of people who are opposed to US foreign policy and the way that policy is implemented domestically. And they
Yeah.
do that so that we don't get to do exactly what we're doing right now, right?
Right.
So
Right.
if we all are always angry that we're not given access in this capitalist system domestically because of the color of our skin, we always focus our struggle on just that one small thing that is really not, again, as bad as racism it is not the sole primary contradiction, because
Mhm.
imperialism is not carried out because of racism. Imperialism uses racism
Right.
to advance its the same way capitalism operates.
Right.
And
Right.
they really
Yeah.
cannot be successful. They couldn't have been as successful as they are without using racism to convince entire populations
Yeah.
that you benefit from subjugating these brown, Asian, indigenous, Palestinian people. Because
Mhm.
I got to tell you, I am looking at this picture of Pyongyang in 1950, Christine.
Yeah.
And if you took the caption off, I would say, is that Gaza?
Yeah. Yep.
So what is the connection aside from, and this is where you come to these conclusions, I think, and
I,
being in community with people with academics like Dr. Sharice
yeah.
Stelly, who
Mhm.
helping me make these connections and giving me, the breadcrumbs to go where to go to make to get the rest of the connections, so that when we're faced with this knowledge, we can see why Pyongyang in 1950, looking like this as a result of American imperialism, is connected to Gaza in 2024 and 2025 for the
Yes.
exact same reason.
Yes. I mean, the bombing was so utterly indiscriminate that there was people actually testified there was nothing left standing worth the bomb to drop. And it was and this is before the era of drone warfare, but
Mhm.
it was basically mass slaughter through pushing a button. This is an alienated kill chain. Like when they say that the Korean War is a forgotten or unknown war, even the people who are deployed there could just like go from Japan to the Korean Peninsula, fly over, do a bombing raid with facing no opposition whatsoever, and just wreak this kind of horror. And yes, I mean the connections between Palestine and Korea are also profound. More than the former Soviet Union and more than China, North Korea served as the arena for the training of guerrilla fighters from
Mm.
all around the world. And that included George Habash. So, there is a deep connection on that level in terms of revolutionary struggle. It's
Mhm.
also the case that in 1948, when the divided Koreas emerged because the United States stages a fake election in the South and puts up its like puppet dictator,
Mhm.
who's reliably will, wage war against his own people. Um, in 1948, in the spring, and this is the year when the Genocide Convention is rolled out at the UN, what happens is in the southernmost part of the Korean Peninsula on this beautiful island called Jeju.
Mm.
There were allegations that the Jeju Islanders, who protested against the US author division of the Korean Peninsula and its staging of separate elections, realizing that would mean that would break the back of Korean self-determination. Realizing that Korea would be divided. The people furthest from the north rose up in protest. And what happened was the United States, which was the military occupier at the time, authorized not only the deployment of South Korean forces against the Jeju Islanders, this is where genocide was perpetrated, but also unleashed these anti-communist, let's say that they would be on like the US's white list, okay? These anti-communist fascist thugs, these fascist paramilitaries to do scorched earth warfare against the Jeju Islanders, perpetrating a genocide, a US-backed genocide. So the connections between Sasam and the Nakba are that the United States keeps telling us that the South Korea is our reliable democratic ally and that South Korea was birthed as a democracy. And also says that Israel is its reliable democratic partner in the Middle East. But in both instances, everyone should know that these states were birthed in an atmosphere of terrorism
Mhm.
and that they were shaped and carved through fascist force. And everyone should know that the United States relies upon the generation of instability through a divided Korean peninsula and then its backing of Israel in order to use that flexibly to maintain its domination in those respective parts of the world.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I'm so glad that you raised the issue of fascism because there is a lot I don't under well I do understand the confusion. Obviously it is stemmed the confusion in the US about what fascism is or is not is absolutely stemming from the same propaganda that we're talking about. So we are also propagandized to believe certain things about things that really do exist. Fascism is a real thing, but in the United States, it's very interesting. We are indoctrinated to believe that the only fascism is the Hitler kind of fascism. And if fascism does not show up, if it doesn't show up with the Hugo Boss designed uniforms, because I hope you all know that Hugo Boss designed the this is the enduring a connection between fascism and capitalism. This is
Yeah,
I love this kind of thing. There are so much about modern capitalist society globally, but particularly in the United States, that we don't understand some of the things that we quote unquote enjoy have very fascist connections. Like Hugo Boss literally designed the Nazi
yes,
uniforms.
yes,
So that just blows my mind that that
yes,
Hugo Boss is still a thing in this country and I guess in the world. But yes, a Nazi fashion brought to you by Hugo Boss. Henry Ford was supportive of the Nazi regime. It was it that Hitler gave him an award or he sent Hitler a nice letter. Hitler, I can't remember what the detail, but there is evidence of the connection between Henry Ford's support of the Nazi regime when they knew what they were doing and the Nazi regime. So
mhm,
there are plenty of other there's the creation of Fanta orange soda here in the United States was created so that the United States company Coca-Cola could sell its products in Nazi Germany, could sell Coca-Cola in Nazi. Do you understand? So
yeah,
there are
yeah,
so many the connections between capitalism and fascism are
yeah.
absolutely there. But
I,
because we are
yes,
never taught these things in our public school or even college courses, and because we enjoy some of these institutions that are still around, but they have been reformed to represent the American spirit,
mhm,
American innovation, American freedom. And understand that in a capitalist society, any capitalist society, when politicians talk about freedom, they are talking about freedom of the economy, freedom of the capitalists. When they talk about freedom and liberty in a capitalist society, they're not talking about individual liberty or human rights. They
mhm,
mean freedom for the rich to make as much money as they
Yeah.
want to in any way they want to. We are not clear on that because we are indoctrinated to believe that in this society, freedom and liberty applies to us individually, and it never was intended to be that way. But
Yeah.
we are indoctrinated to believe that, Ford Motor Cars and Hugo Boss and Coca-Cola are as American as apple pie, and we do not recognize the fascist connections that these institutions now have because we're propagandized to see fascism as a particular thing,
Right. Right.
as jackbooted thugs by the thousands
Right.
marching behind big, ornate, Roman designed placards and, that kind of thing. If it doesn't look like that, a lot of people in the United States believe
Mhm.
it's not fascist. So,
Exactly.
yeah, so you've had timely, perfect timing. So you've had people like this person. I really hate saying that man's name. But just in case no one knows who he is, you have Barack Obama literally using Black soldiers' involvement in the Korean War as some type of we're all unified, we're all American, kumbaya moment, let's celebrate, but completely outside of the context of the material reality of what that war was and what the US government did. And the
Mhm.
idea for Black people, for an oppressed population, for a colonized people inside the United States, because we do live in domestic colonies. And
Yes.
part of the work that we do in BAP is getting our people to understand what colonization is and why it matters to you. Because you do live on a domestic, you live in a domestic colony in your neighborhoods. But
Mhm.
Obama and these comments and his entire presidency, quite honestly, represent the cynical use of representational politics to indoctrinate the group of people who are being exploited by American domestic fascism
That's
in a
right.
racialized manner
Right.
to convince those people that, listen, you were able to participate in this great democratic exercise of the liberation of a people from tyranny and dictatorship and authoritarianism in Korea. And we did it together. And not
Right.
only is all of that a blatant lie, because the United States military was segregated at the beginning of the Korean War,
That's right.
the US
That's right.
military had to be forced to desegregate. And it didn't, we understand how hateful people, you can tell them to do
Right.
something and they might do it, but they're not going to do it the way you want them to do.
Oh, and they were
So,
the units over there were flying Dixie flags,
yes.
and then the US military actually prevented Black soldiers from reading the Pittsburgh Courier, the, Chicago Defender, and
Hmm.
other Black newspapers because they didn't want the news about the violence of domestic apartheid in the Jim Crow system to reach the soldiers on the war front. And so there was a deliberate sort of um, withholding of news on the war front. And so this kind of like, weird, retrospective glorification of the Korean War as a sort of post-racial milestone really has disabled an understanding of what racism means and what racism, how essential racism is for imperialism. And I wanted to say something about what you were saying, which is that you said like people don't understand the connection between fascism and capitalism. They don't understand it at all. And they think, as you say, that like you have to be goose stepping. You have to be goose stepping, and that's fascism,
Right, right,
or that it's Donald Trump. Donald Trump, but nothing else is like so. That's the way fascism gets sort of exceptionalized. But it's actually, I think it's so interesting to see that actually it's from our revolutionary elders, who actually Black radicals who said that fascism is connected to capitalism, and it tries to create war unity
Mhm.
by overriding and disavowing the contradictions of class and race in order to foster a kind of unified national consciousness against a shared enemy. And that was that becomes multiculturalism in the wake of World War II. It's not
Mhm.
recognized as fascism. And then what happens is the concept of totalitarianism intervenes and yokes fascism to communism
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
says that these are two forms, it's, like Arendtian, like two forms of twinned evils. And
Right.
so then the sort of political clarity around what fascism actually is, at a moment when the United States is expanding militarily around the world, at a moment, yeah, like it can't even be recognized for what it is.
Mhm.
And I wanted to say, or maybe we can go, because we want to keep some time for questions, but I want to say that,
Yes.
this is our revolutionary elder, Paul Robeson,
Mhm.
who took We Charge Genocide to the UN in 1951. And Paul Robeson, you know, um, actually, could we go to the next slide? You could see here too, Paul Robeson and the Civil Rights Congress, they were in LA. They were in an organizing political milieu of Communist Party members and fellow travelers that included the Korean diasporic editorial board of 독립신문, which is the Korean Independent. And I've often wondered, why is it? Can we go to the next slide? Why is it that the Civil Rights Congress had such a pointed and sharp critique of the Korean War? It's because there is solidarity on the ground. There is
Mhm.
solidarity on the ground between Black radicals and Korean communists. That was on the ground, and they were studying together. They were working against repression together. They were working against deportation together.
Mhm.
And what happened was, on the Korean War battlefront, there was this propaganda leaflet that was co-signed by China and North Korea, and it's addressed to Negro soldiers. And here, the information about the lynchings that were occurring stateside that was getting intercepted by the US military was furnished.
Mhm.
And also in this pamphlet, which was multi-pages, could you go to the next slide, Natalie? You could see that, well, Paul Robeson, I'll just say, like, in that pamphlet was also a section from the We Charge Genocide petition.
Yes. Mhm.
So North Koreans are taking this and reflecting it back on the battlefield. And you can see that Paul Robeson, just 3 days after Truman declares a so-called police action, says, what the heck? There's not a democracy in South Korea. There's a despicable puppet. You have like this flunky, you have like these, and then says, okay, we're not fooled. If we don't stop this in Korea, tomorrow it's Africa.
Mhm.
Maw of the war makers is insatiable. They want to rule the world or destroy it. Their slogan is all or none.
Mhm.
And I'm so moved when I see self-determination for all peoples, hands off Korea. My God, that
Mhm.
applies to this moment. Could you go to the next slide? And so this slide too, this is from We Charge Genocide. William Patterson and others understood that the modality of lynching was shifting. And it was at one point the lyncher's noose, but it had become the policeman's bullet. There's a regime of police terror. There's a police state domestically. And people poo-poo the term police action. They're like, oh, that's Truman's way of like not using the term war, like it, and getting around, like being able to unilaterally declare this war. But actually, I think, what if we dwelled with that term police action to understand what's still happening to North Korea to
Mhm.
this day?
Mhm.
And to see that the William Patterson, the other writers of this petition said, a nation that practices genocide against its own people is not going to be deterred from genocide around the world, that lynching, unrebuked lynching at home, was tied to the undiscriminate use of napalm in Korea, and that the tie between both is economic profit and political control. And Madeline, can you just go to the next slide? I wanted to say this because, in no small part, your bulletin on US domestic militarization, I can hear the echoes of your revolutionary elders in that analysis, understanding that militarized policing can't be understood outside US war adventurism around the globe, and that this image of anti-Black police terror at Ferguson is also Islamophobic, anti-Arab, because it comes from the theater of the war on terror.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, we and I specifically, I think about people like, of course, Paul Robeson, but also people like Claudia Jones,
Yes.
who
That's
I if
Madeline, can you go to the next slide?
yeah, I just the fact that in the face of the repression that anti-imperialist activists were facing in the United States and in other countries around the world, in other capitalist imperialist countries around the world, um, Claudia Jones was she was not unique, but her story is particularly fitting for this moment because she certainly wasn't the only Black woman who was, targeted and repressed for speaking out against the war. In our revolutionary ancestral pantheon, well, in mine anyway, there is Claudia Jones, there is Shirley Du Bois Graham, who is W.E. Du Bois's wife, who as much credit as people give Du Bois, they sleep on Shirley. They really sleep on her. There's Dr. Coretta Scott King. She was more than just Dr. King's wife. She was instrumental in galvanizing the anti-nuclear war effort in the United States with W.E.B. Du Bois and others. But Claudia Jones was also, like Robeson, like Du Bois, targeted specifically by the state for her speaking out against the Korean War in particular. And the things she said about the Korean War in relation to war being particularly damaging for women
That's
were
right.
things that were not said at the time. And whenever I talk about the issue of war, race, imperialism, and how we understand things like fascism, I always think of how Claudia really honed in on what the issues were. So she said things like she connected the bipartisan nature of support for the Korean War. We in BAP are talking about the duopoly right now. In the face of the emergence of the second Trump administration, we are having to talk about the duopoly in the way that we are because people are making this moment about Trump, and as you were saying before, and not about the fact that fascism is here and has been here. And in fact, liberals have facilitated fascism in many ways, and that is how fascism happens. It is the liberal facilitation of a few compromises on some social issues, and then the big compromise on militarism and war and domestic repression. And then the next thing you know, you've got Democrats voting for Cop City and for weapons to be sent to help Israel commit a genocide. You have Obama praising Black soldiers brutally bombing the Korean landscape and slaughtering millions of Korean people for an ideal that has nothing to do with them. This freedom thing that they don't even have in the country that they're allegedly representing. So Claudia Jones was able to drill down to a level even that the men in the movement couldn't have gotten, because she made it an issue about women. And she raised the issue that the reason war is so damaging to women is because the war industry demands super profits. And this is how the devaluing of women's labor is caught up in the war economy. Because then, when all the men are gone off to war, the women have to work in the factories. But the factories are not going to pay the women the same wages that the men got. But you need your men to have all of the weapons they need to fight this war and come home alive. So shut up and take what we give you.
Exactly.
Do you
Yeah.
understand?
Right, right. I mean, that's the thing about like war is like there's command control over labor, there's like union busting, there's like strike
Mm-hmm.
breaking.
Mm-hmm.
And against that kind of propaganda image of Rosie the Riveter, you have the clarity
Yes.
of Claudia Jones.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
it's not that it's like, oh, this is a Democrat, like this is, like war gives, race and woman, rights, like no,
Right.
it's like, and that does remind me of CLR James, who said
Mm.
to war, like, just refused to ever believe that World War II could be a people's war. Just, and basically said, like, I'll believe it's a people's war when we have control over the means of destruction. Then it's a people's war.
Yes, yes. I mean, Claudia said, and I'm looking for this particular issue, this particular comment. She said, hence, no, let me go back. Let me go to the beginning. She said the widespread peace sentiments, particularly of the women and the youth, in their millions, because now she's talking about an appeal that I believe came out of a meeting with some anti-imperialist leaders from anti-imperialist countries, called the Sweden appeal. I think no, the Stockholm appeal.
Oh,
That was
Stockholm
what it was
Appeal. Yep.
called.
Yep.
Yes, and apparently, and I did not know this, in preparing for this panel, I learned some things. And
Yeah.
I am always excited when I learn some things, because I have to tell people what I learned.
Right.
Because I figure if someone who is organizing all the time and always reading stuff and always staying on top of the news, and if I didn't know, you don't know. So you need to
Mm, mm,
know. I
mm,
did
mhm.
not know that practically every citizen of the Soviet Union signed the Stockholm Appeal
Mhm,
to
mhm.
end the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This is the first
Yeah.
time I had ever heard about this. So Claudia Jones was involved in that effort, as was
Yes.
Du Bois, and I think as was Robeson and the Civil Rights Congress, and they all talked about the international solidarity, and Jones in particular is talking about the international solidarity of women
Yeah.
opposed to war and the nuclear
Right.
bomb across the world. So that when she says the widespread peace sentiments, particularly
Mhm.
of the women and the youth and their millions, this is what she's talking about, must be organized and given direction and effective militant expression. And she says this is necessary, that they need militant expression through organization, since the monopolist rulers, the
Mhm.
capitalists, she immediately links capitalism to war and the repression of women. She says the monopolist rulers are doing everything possible to deceive the people and to paralyze their will to fight for peace. Particularly insidious agents of the war makers are the social democracy and reformist labor leaders who trick the working class
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
continuing to support liberal imperialist
Mm.
policies,
Mhm.
while the corporatists who are pushing war are stealing their wages and
Yeah.
denying their benefits, and
Right.
then
Right.
violently repressing them if they come out to speak against the war. So Jones connected things like capitalism and liberalism. She also talked about the reactionary Roman Catholics and the way faith is captured by the state and used as a tool of imperialist propaganda. And in that way, we can see the white Christian nationalist movement doing the same thing.
Right. Right. I mean, it's so interesting because that Stockholm um, sort of peace campaign was framed by anti-communist, forces in the United States as being a Trojan dove. It was called
Right.
a Trojan dove, and people who were trying to get signatures, they were arrested for disturbing the peace. If
Mm-hmm.
you try to get people to sign peace petition, you're disturbing peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
it is, I must note that for her advocacy for peace and against a capitalist driven imperialist war,
she was
if you know,
arrested
yeah, she was arrested and
and
she
then
was
deported.
deported.
Yep, yep,
She was arrested and deported.
yep.
So we see the response to now Jones, Du Bois, both of them, W.E.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois, Robeson, all of the so many others, Dr. Coretta Scott King, so many others who were involved in the anti-imperialist movement during the Cold War against nuclear weapons, against the Korean War, and then against the Vietnam War. Of course, the opposition began in World War One with people speaking out against World War One, and there was a lot of anti-war agitation among the labor movements, which got swept up into the anti-communist fervor. The only reason you're opposing the U.S. getting involved in World War One is because you must be influenced by the communist Russians. Or then later on it became, the sneaky evil communist Asians in China or the DPRK. Opposition to imperialist policy in this country has always been met by the state with accusations of communist influence, Russia or China, violent repression, suppression of freedom of speech, and very often imprisonment, and sometimes in extreme cases like Claudia Jones, deportation, and with the case of Marcus Garvey also deportation. So the
As well as
state,
assassination.
yes, and assassination up to, so the price, historically we know that the price we may pay for opposing empire is with our what vestiges of freedom we have and our life. We know that through the history. Dialectically, materially, we understand that the response to our calling out the empire for what it is, exposing its skirt, explaining to our people, this is not democracy, this is not liberation, this isn't freedom, this is not protecting anybody, this is fascism, and both parties support it. This is why we have to talk about the duopoly and the capitalist system and not just Donald Trump. And we understand that the response from the state is repression. We have experienced that. And we've seen it in the modern era with the recent prosecution of the Uhuru Three, Omali Yeshitela, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, 80 something years old, been in the struggle for 50, 60 years, was accused by the FBI under the Biden administration of operating or conspiring to act as an agent of Russia. Prosecuted, raided, their properties were raided by the FBI in a violent raid, prosecuted by the FBI under the Biden administration, received a split decision, was found not guilty on conspiring to be on acting as an agent of Russia, but they were found inexplicably, makes no sense, they were found guilty of conspiring to act on the thing that they weren't. Made no sense. And they includes Penny Hess and Jesse Neville, two white members of the Uhuru movement, which is the solidarity movement connected with the APSP. So even with the split decision, they should have gotten at least 3 years prison time for the ridiculous conspiring to be agents of the thing that they didn't actually do. But the judge in this case, in a very interesting I found it very interesting. The judge in this case, just last year, just in November, I think the sentencing was finally carried out. The judge was a Trump appointed judge who ruled that he would not give them prison time. He couldn't, according, under the law, he could not punish them because they were found guilty of one charge, regardless of how illogical and ridiculous it was. The judge says, I can't not charge you with anything, but I'm not going to send you to prison because from what I can tell, all you've done is exercise political speech. And even though I hate everything you
Yeah.
say and stand for, the judge literally said from the bench as he is issuing his decision on their sentencing, he says, I don't agree with anything these people say. I think they are spitting on the flag that gives them the freedom they are, all that kind of, patriotic
Yeah.
foolishness.
Yeah.
But then he turns right around and says, but I cannot send them to prison because all they did was engage in political speech. And
Mhm.
if we silence political speech, even if we disagree with it, we would be putting a chilling effect on all speech. And as much as I hate what they say, I am not going to punish them for their right to say it because they do have a right to exercise political speech. So this Trump appointed judge
Yeah.
sentenced them to like 300 hours of community service and, told them to get the heck out of my courtroom,
Yeah.
basically. So we see in the modern era everything that our revolutionary ancestors, Robeson, Du Bois, and his wife Du Bois, and Claudia Jones, and Dr. Coretta Scott King. Is she a doctor? I can't remember. But and so many others before us have told us about what it is we need to win against imperialism. And it's courage. Number one, it is courage. We are going up against a state that celebrates doing what it did to Korea.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
psychotic
Yeah.
in every sense of the word. So we are not going up, we understand we are not going up against an entity or people who prop the entity up who are sane or reasonable. We are
Mhm.
clear about that. So we must have courage in speaking out against the truth about what this entity, what the United States government does to other people around the world and why that matters to us. So we must
Yeah.
have courage, but we also must engage in an unrelenting and uncompromising international solidarity with the
Yes. Yes.
people around the world who are still
Yeah.
struggling against US imperialism,
Yeah.
driven by the dictatorship of finance, capitalism. That is unequivocally necessary in the struggle against imperialism. If we do not connect with the people around the world who can show us, nobody can show us in Southeast DC better why what was done to Korea should matter to Black folks in Southeast DC than Black folks in Southeast DC hearing from Koreans why
Mhm.
it matters and learning this history about where the struggle for Black liberation intersects with the
Yeah.
Korean struggle against imperialism. And where
Mhm.
do we take that today? Today, this is why BAP exists.
Yeah. I have loved being in conversation with you. On
Okay.
behalf of the collective, I thank you. And, in the spirit of international solidarity, I claim Claudia Jones and Paul Robeson as among my revolutionary forebears. And I am so inspired by them. We are so inspired by you, Jackie. We look
Oh, goodness.
forward to working with you in this movement and are so grateful to have you as a comrade. Thank you.
No, I thank you. I really appreciate it. And honestly, on behalf of the entire BAP formation, I always like to tell people that, you know, we are some serious Africans. We are, this is not a pastime for us. You know, BAP is a volunteer organization. I think we have 3 paid staff members, and they all do admin stuff for the entire formation. We are a volunteer led and driven organization. Um, we are serious about this work because we have been impacted by this imperial project that we are trying so desperately to defeat. This history of human degradation that the system that our taxes prop up, for
Mhm.
many of us in this formation, we are deeply grieved that we are in any way implicated in the suffering of other people around the world. So every time we have an opportunity to be in conversation with those people, the first thing we do is to ask people, what can we do to be of better service to you? We
Mhm.
do not want to be the experts on imperialism walking into everybody's room. We don't want to be imperialists, right? Because that's what that is. We understand that our struggle for liberation and our extension of that struggle doesn't just reach the continent of Africa because we are Pan-Africanists. And we understand that until Africa is free, nobody is free. But we understand that in the context that in order for Africa to be free, we have to be in solidarity with Africans. And it is Africans that have to tell us in the diaspora in this part how we can be in solidarity, how we can amplify their struggle. So when we do that with our relatives, our direct relatives on the continent, we understand we have to do that in every community we are engaged in solidarity with.
Mhm.
So we enter this space in your community asking you, what can we do in the Black Alliance for Peace to be of service in advancing the struggle of Koreans against imperialism? What message do you want us to internalize so that we can understand what we can do to help you advance your struggle? And in that way, all of our struggle gets advanced. So we
Mhm.
appreciate the opportunity to be just even considered to be in this space. And we do not take it lightly that we have been invited here. So thank you, truly.
Jackie, we will continue the organizing together, and we look forward to it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. Um, we know that we went over time a little bit, but
I
thank you
overtalked
so much.
again. I get
Yeah,
so
yeah,
excited.
yeah. I've loved this conversation.
Very chatty. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I have to work on that.
oh, are you, it's, yeah, it is, it's brilliant and it's illuminating.
Thank you.
It
Thank
really is. We need to have conversations that clarify.
you. I hope
It's
I hope
urgent.
clarity was provided.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Peace.
Jackie, thank you so much.
Absolutely. And peace to all of you.
Yeah.
You know, aluta continua, the struggle continues. But if
Mhm.
we keep fighting and if we fight together, we are
Yes.
guaranteed to win. Victoria asserta. Victory
Mhm.
is certain.
Mhm. Mhm. You can count on us. Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. Thank you.